Greetings and welcome to this online lecture series on a revolutionary new way of understanding the Bible, developed by Eugen Drewermann, an internationally best-selling author of more than 100 books. In this lecture series, we look specifically at his interpretation of the Gospel of Mark, which set the tone for many other of his interpretations. The whole purpose of Drewermann's reinterpretations of the Bible is to help us connect to the experiences that first led to these stories and have similar healing experiences and liberating experiences in our own lives. Drewermann tries to cut through all the dogmatic reification of these texts, in which basically these texts are just used as terms, almost like as fossils, that really don't have much to do with our lives, or, and this is very significant, where they're used in moralistic ways that actually are turned against us, and where God is portrayed sort of like a big narcissist who wants to break our will. Drewermann's interpretation is a very different interpretation. And so this is the subject of this lecture series. Drewermann believes that Jesus did not talk about God in these ways, and Drewermann is trying to show under the debris of interpretations that span the last 2 millennia that there's actually a lot in these stories that addresses our own existential predicament, our own struggles, our own forms of despair, our own longings. So that is what we're going to go into. I would like to just give you a brief recap of what we talked about in our first 2 lectures. In the first 2 lectures, we looked at how Drewermann sheds light on the existential backdrop for a radically transformative action in the Gospel of Mark. We learned that the experience of despair that is portrayed in the 3rd chapter of the Bible in Genesis 3 is very similar to the experience of evil that is the backdrop of healing and liberation in the Gospel of Mark. Now, you know that this story of the so-called fall of Adam and Eve, who are supposedly took the apple. There's no mention of an apple in this story. Actually, it's a fruit. And that is supposed to have been an act of disobedience against the will of God, and therefore they were thrown out of paradise. That's sort of the line. That is the common interpretation in Christianity, and that is the so-called notion or doctrine of original sin. And based on that, the religious leaders have sort of built a superstructure, a moral superstructure that has been used to control people in ways that tells them, oh, you need to be acting morally in this way. Our culture wars are all built around this, the control of sexuality, the breaking of the will, the telling people, you know, you have to repent your sin, you have to convert from your evil ways. Everything has been moralized by interpreting this story as a moral story. And Drewermann argues this is not a moral story. And if we closely listen to this story, then we will find out about that. And Drewermann also points out that actually the people that have interpreted this story or that have told us what this story is supposed to mean, the exegetes, the theologians have often missed the mark and have supported these moralistic interpretations. Drewermann has interpreted the story in depth in his first major work that has the title Structures of Evil. It has not been translated into English yet, but it is a monumental work that resets all of theology, basically. This is the first volume of this 3-volume oeuvre. It's called Structures of Evil, the Yahwist Primordial History in Exegetical Perspective is the first volume. The Yahwist Primordial History, it's called Yahwist because the author, one of the authors in the first 12 chapters of the Bible, is thought to have used the word Yahweh to describe God, whereas 2 other sources have used the word Elohim. And so this Yahwist primordial history, which is thought to be before the sort of, not really the beginning of history, but before the beginning of history. And Drewermann points out that the Hebrew understanding of beginning is actually not a historical beginning, but more like something that is, this is how things are. This is how we are in principle. And so that is what these stories are actually talking about. So the first major correction Drewermann suggests in his interpretation, and that we talked about in the first lecture that you can look at on YouTube as well in this lecture series, is that what Christianity has called sin and blamed on human disobedience is not at all portrayed in the actual story of the so-called fall as an act of disobedience. Rather, the story portrays a profound sense of anxiety, of fear to lose one's ground under one's feet. And that is something, that is an experience that we all can relate. And only then do these characters in the story desperately try to calm that anxiety by means that will actually never calm it. They try to use anything in what we might call the finite world, anything that really cannot be an absolute ground, be it reputation, if we want to bring it into our experience world, be it a job, be it the recognition that others give us that can easily be taken away, be it something that we ourselves created and thought that would last forever, and it doesn't last forever. So you have to imagine that that would be kind of the fruit. And I have actually given a sermon, there's a sermon on this channel that connects this to us dealing with the scarcity principle. So you can take a look at how I applied Drewermann's interpretation in a sermon. So this correction that the story is not about disobedience, it is about despair. And that will also be a part of what we're going to look at today in this lecture. The second lecture dealt with how the Gospel of Mark doesn't talk about really disobedience. It also doesn't talk explicitly so much about anxiety. The way the Gospel of Mark portrays this anxiety and despair is by talking about evil. It talks about evil spirit, it talks about the devil, and it basically portrays with these terms that are coming out of ancient Jewish apocalypticism. It picked up that language, and probably Jesus himself was familiar with this language and used some of this language. But the Gospel of Mark put a particular spin on it that Jesus likely did not have. So the Gospel of Mark uses this kind of language to immerse itself into what the world is like when it's experienced as not good. And again, this is not just not morally good, like what we sort of hear in our news all the time, that somebody did this bad thing or that bad thing. And so we are so accustomed to thinking of good and evil as morally good and evil. This is not actually what the Gospel of Mark is talking about either. It's not good or evil in a moral sense, but rather in an existential sense of feeling that the world is not good, in the sense of that our life is insignificant, that we're not mattering, that we're not good enough, that we're not important. And so what talk of devil and evil spirits stands for, this is what Drewermann argues, is psychologically is when we are possessed by other people's voices. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, what's very significant is that these other people's voices are explicitly cast as voices that are using the name of God, using the title of God, using the reference of God to make people feel not good. Now, this is an experience that so many people today are connecting with, because as we know in the United States, at least, and also in many other Western countries, many people are turning their backs against organized religion. The Pew Center for Research calls them the nones, N-O-N-E-S, the people that don't identify with organized religion anymore. And many of those folks have turned their backs on organized religion because organized religion is actually using talk of God in ways that depresses, that makes people desperate, because it moralizes talk of God. And so Drewermann suggests that the Gospel of Mark actually has Jesus break down this kind of moralistic talk of God that we find in all forms of religion. And Jesus, in that sense, was a particular kind of prophet in his own religion, just like other prophets in his own religion. Jesus was not against his own religion. Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was not against his own form of religion, his own form of Judaism, but he wanted to recover the I-thou relationship that Martin Buber talks about, that is really at the heart of Judaism. And what we can learn from there is that in all forms of religion, there can be a way of the moralization of religion that actually takes people away from a life-giving relationship to their source of life. And now the word God, though, has been so misused that many people are actually unable to connect to this anymore, and so become atheists or agnostics. I once worked with a patient who grew up in a sort of a non-denominational, almost cult-like form of Christianity here in the United States. And she came to me because she had developed a fear of flying, and she had severe panic attacks. And what I learned as I worked with her is that her mother was experienced by this particular patient as a sort of like Jesus, but a moralizing Jesus, a mother figure who had completely moralized God. And so what the mother would say to her daughter when the daughter had this fear of flying, the mother would say, well, why don't you pray more to God? And this just ramped up the anxiety, as if it was a moral failure for this patient to not be able to lose her fear of flying. This is the kind of experience we have to keep in mind when we think about the characters and the stories in the Gospel of Mark. Here are people who are told, oh, believe only more. Oh, it's a moral failure that you don't believe more in God. And what we're going to talk about today is how Jesus completely shifts the perspective, because this perspective, this moralistic perspective, actually is still part of the beginning of the journey of Jesus himself, as he is being baptized by John the Baptist. And so today we will talk about the story of the radical difference between the message of John the Baptist and the message of Jesus. Now, I said that what Drewermann pointed out about the talk of evil spirits and the talk of the devil can psychologically be understood as us being kind of possessed, not in this exorcism kind of thing, which is today even being revived in the Roman Catholic Church and in Protestant churches. That is a form of superstition that has nothing to do with this. In fact, that is again being used to actually control people, to instill fear of the people, to sort of make the people that have these magic exorcism skills of driving out exorcism. But really what that is, psychology, psychoanalytic psychology would sort of talk about counter cathexis. That's a technical term you don't have to remember here, but sort of like you try to basically drive out the devil by sort of, not by becoming the devil, but by sort of setting yourself in the power place. And then you are the one who has the power and is venerated. And when religious officials do this, they make people really dependent on themselves. And so that's really the psychological dilemma, that when people believe in this kind of magic exorcism stuff. So that's the psychological aspect. Now, Drewermann says we cannot stop there, that actually the whole talk of devil and evil spirits actually gets existentially, meaning in terms of our whole existence, or Drewermann uses the term Daseinsanalysis. Dasein is the word in German for existence, and so it's a form of existential psychology that is wedded to depth psychology. That's what that means. And that so beyond our psychological experience, existentially, we deal with when we feel that our own existence feels like desperate, feels like not good enough, is preoccupied with ultimate concerns that are in free fall, basically. Fears of not mattering. When we feel we're dominated by the scarcity principle of despair. Drewermann here connects with Søren Kierkegaard, one of the existential philosophers, who also influenced one of the most well-known Protestant theologians in the United States, Paul Tillich. Tillich coined this phrase, ultimate concerns. And Drewermann, on some level, relates to those folks. They're in his background there. And so when we experience the world as a place where we don't matter, that we don't really are wanted to exist. It's not just that, oh yeah, of course I exist. That's not the point. It's do we matter? Do we meaningfully exist in the face of the anxiety of our death, of our fear of death, of our contingency, our vulnerability, our limitedness, our experience of our non-being, because that's what kind of death represents. That's what the experience of loss represents. When we have loss in relationships, when we have loss in meaning, those are all instances where our contingency rears its ugly head, our non-being. So it's not just about physical death, it's about our experience also of feeling like we're missing ourselves, we've squandered our life. We're in all of these experiences, we're confronted with our non-being and with our sense of that, have we perhaps not really existed? Now, while religion should be the place to help us stay in touch with who we really are, when religion is used to alienate us from ourselves, then religion itself turns God into a demon and tends to demonize us as well. Drewermann's radical new interpretation of biblical stories aims to undo this demonizing of God and humans that has been done in the name of the Bible against the intent of Jesus. And so Drewermann tries to recover the Jesus who was going against the demonizing of God and the demonizing of humans. A final important point from the last lecture is that Drewermann pointed out that the idea of devil actually in the Bible gradually developed as a way of taking out what we would think is morally objectionable in God, because God was portrayed in the Bible for a long time as someone who would smite people, who would just capriciously do things that we as humans are not supposed to do. And so that there is a development in the Bible that this evil is sort of farmed out to the devil, and so that the devil becomes kind of the cluster and evil spirits become kind of the cluster of holding that evil. Now, Drewermann discusses how Jung said, actually, Carl Gustav Jung, the great Swiss psychologist and originally a psychoanalyst, then developing his own analytic psychology, argues that if we farm that out into the devil, then we're kind of creating a shadow, and that itself needs to be reintegrated even into the God image. Drewermann argues that, well, the idea of God actually is something different. We cannot reduce God to the psyche in that sense, and to this idea of psychic integration. But we also shouldn't metaphysicize the devil. Metaphysicize means to sort of create the devil as a metaphysical being in itself that is opposed to God as a being, and God being a being. Because if we do that, what has happened in Christianity is that then the devil becomes the one who actually uses us humans as the playground of evil intentions. And so then we are turned into metaphysically evil beings, evil persons, all the way to the point that we are then easily being disposable, that then we can be fought in the Inquisition as absolutely opposed to God, that we can be exterminated. The Salem witch trials here in the United States, the genocide against indigenous people, the racist demonizing that we see everywhere, the reduction of foreigners to absolute others whom we can neutralize, which means brutally kill in our sanctified wars. All of these are instances in which we see this metaphysicizing of evil in the form of devil at play. There is this widely popular series, the so-called Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye, that had sold over, I think, close to 100 million or so copies around the planet. That is one of those series that talks in this metaphysicizing way, and that pits the certain people metaphysically against God. Here in the United States, it's not uncommon to see other forces, other countries as on the side of the devil. The whole communist witch hunt, the ideas that in the first Gulf War, Dick Cheney and others very seriously considered to throw a nuclear bomb on the Middle East. All of these things are not imaginable without these forms of theology, of seeing others as absolute evil. And so Drewermann argues we have to recover an understanding of the Bible that makes this kind of misuse of the Bible and this kind of misuse of Jesus and this kind of misuse of God absolutely impossible. So against this backdrop, Drewermann shows how Jesus himself actually began at his own baptism to completely change everything. So today's lecture talks about the end of moralism in religion by showing the radical difference between Jesus and John the Baptist. Drewermann's reinterpretation of this text changes everything. Much of Christianity, in a way, is practiced very much today in the moralistic spirit of John the Baptist, rather than the very new spirit of Jesus. Whether it is altar calls for repentance before God in Protestantism, or the remorseful penitent confession in Catholicism, the focus in traditional Christianity is on humans repenting, turning away from their old rotten ways. Against this, Jesus actually sets what we hear about in this story today. In Mark 1, Mark chapter 1, verses 9 to 11. And I want to again show you the German version of this commentary from which I am translating portions that are part of these lectures. And so Jesus sets against this moralistic distortion of religion the belief that he experienced himself, namely that God says to us, "You are my beloved son," or "my beloved child, my beloved daughter. With you I am well pleased." This is the spirit of how Jesus experienced God. This is what he conveyed as an experience to every person, in contrast to the fire and brimstone message of John the Baptist. Now, part of the problem here is that Christianity very quickly used this verse, "You are my beloved son, with you I am well pleased," to basically say this is only about Jesus. And then it set Jesus above all other people and said, now you have to all worship Jesus because he is the Son of God. So this verse was used as referring to, oh, Jesus got this title, he is the Son of God, rather than looking at the experience that is behind it and that Jesus wanted to democratize. Now, this is very important because if we do not follow this democratization of that experience, that we all are absolutely valuable, then what we do is basically we keep this title, Son of God, in the way that is nothing else but what people associated with this very same title in Egyptian religion, because the Pharaoh already was called the Son of God. I've showed you in a previous lecture that Drewermann wrote this book, Discovering the Godchild Within. And in this book, Drewermann shows that the idea of the Son of God actually can partly be traced to ancient Egyptian ideas of the Pharaoh being the Son of God. And in Egyptian religion, the pharaoh was thought to be born from a virgin from the day he was enthroned as the pharaoh. From that day on, he was thought to be just coming from God, meaning his role was given by God. Something very similar is actually behind the idea of the virgin birth in the gospel, the Gospel of Luke. It has nothing to do with biological virginity, as I've emphasized in a previous lecture. Instead, it means that we are not dependent in our value by what other people tell us our value is. It's not our parents who establish our value. It's not our boss. It's not our group that we're part of. It's not the party. It's not what people say about us that gives us meaning. Our meaning is absolutely given even before our birth. That is what the story of virgin birth means. And again, it's not just about Jesus, it's about for everyone. This is what this story is about. So what Jesus wanted to do is use this experience that he had, the experience of you are my beloved son, with you I'm well pleased, as an experience that he wanted to help facilitate in every human being. So let's go into the interpretation that Jesus had of this experience, and how Drewermann recovers this meaning here. So the text is in Mark 1:9. Thus it happened in those days, Jesus of Nazareth in Galilee came and was immersed in the Jordan by John. And immediately after he emerged from the water, he saw the heavens split open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from the heavens, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." And now I'm reading from Drewermann's interpretation. I will read portions of it, and I'm asking you to stay with the whole lecture here today, because it builds, the momentum builds, and there are some really surprising turns here. So I invite you to stay with this. So here's how he starts. All people who suffer under the injustice of the world would like to see that finally a person such as John the Baptist appear. Someone who calls injustice by its name without making it look pretty, who quotes the powerful and reads them the riot act, who without mincing words names, denounces, and pillories all the evil in the world that needs to be fought. How much would already be gained if theologians today could decide to write like this? So honestly, so bluntly, so committedly calling for change, warning of disaster, showing ways out. However, history tells us that simple sermons for repentance are not even effective as short-term political tactic, let alone as long-term strategy against evil. As long as we just rant against evil and read out loud manifestos, we stay on the surface and fight symptoms. But the disease itself does not get cured that way. Drewermann references here his book on War and Christianity, or actually it was published under a new title, The Spiral of Anxiety, War and Christianity. This is a book that he published in, I think, 1982 or 1981. It was reissued in many languages. There were speeches edit that he gave during the first Gulf War in 1991 in January and February. And he looks at how Christianity inadvertently has actually fostered the mentality of war and has created war. I have described in my second chapter in the introduction of Drewermann's work, A Violent God Image, this analysis of war in Christianity in depth. So you can take a look at that. Drewermann continues, Karl Marx once said it was necessary that, quote, shame is made more shameful by publishing it, unquote. This is quoted in the book on religion, which you can look up. It's Marx and Engels on religion. Drewermann continues, but if we leave it at that, meaning make the shame more shameful, then we act like someone who wants to cure influenza by asking the sick person to loudly cough, and blow their nose. Thinking this way is quite naive, as Søren Kierkegaard ironized it. As if it is a simple matter of chance or whim that people at any given moment would be good, bad, righteous, malicious, good-natured, or angry. And Drewermann here quotes from Søren Kierkegaard's well-known work, The Sickness Unto Death. What he talks about here is that this focus on sin as particular actions that Kierkegaard really counters here, that when the Bible actually talks about sin, it's not about particular actions. This is how we often misunderstand it. And of course, in the Bible itself, there are instances where this is done that way already. But Drewermann argues that when that is the case, there's already a spiral of anxiety and despair that has happened. And it's our task to see how the God image, even the Bible, has been distorted, and that the Bible tries to find ways how this God image can be worked through. So I want to actually give you a little bit of the quote that Drewermann cites here from Kierkegaard. So this is what Kierkegaard writes there. Most men, meaning most people, probably live with all too little consciousness of themselves to have any idea of what consistency is, meaning not just one guilty act and then another guilty act, but sort of a sense of despair, an underlying feeling of something's wrong with the world or with our sense of our limitations, our vulnerability, and so on. So Kierkegaard continues, they do not exist qua spirit. Their lives, either in a certain endearing childish naivete or in shallow triviality, are made up of some action of sorts, some incidents of this and that. Now they do something good and then something stupid, and then they begin all over again. Now they're in despair, but then they're jolly fellows again, and then once again in despair for a day. They play along in life, so to speak, but they never experience putting everything together on one thing, never achieve the idea of an infinite self-consistency. That is why they're always talking among themselves about the particular good deeds, particular sins. And so this is the end of the quote. This is sort of like when we get lost in the daily news of, oh, this bad thing, that bad thing, and then here's this good thing or that good thing, but we don't really think about our existence as a whole. So that's what Drewermann quotes here to kind of make that point. Drewermann continues, psychology already shows that our behavior cannot be seen in isolation, but that it is instead the logical result of latent attitudes. Apparently, Jesus had a similar view of human guilt. Whenever he speaks of the sin of humans, and it's so hard not to hear the word sin in a moralistic tone, but bear with me here. It becomes clear that this is not how it's meant. So Jesus does not portray us as people who, among other things, have certain debts, but as people whose whole life consists only of guilt. And again, meaning not in a moralistic sense, but of feeling like we're limited, we're contingent, and we're despairing of it. This is what this means. Then, of course, it no longer makes sense to call for certain modifications. If someone swears a pauper's oath, like declares bankruptcy, then all possible requests for payments are useless. Similarly, Jesus does not start by demanding so-called acts of repentance and conversion. Rather, he first calls decidedly for a pauper's oath before God. Now, here I want to importantly emphasize that Jesus does not do this to establish God as the great narcissist before whom we have to bow and break our will. It is so hard not to hear these things in moralistic tones. Rather, this is about realizing our existential predicament, about our realization that we cannot create an absolute ground under our feet, even though we try to do so. It means that we can stop doing actually that. We can stop thinking that we have to be like the hamster in the wheel of time, or to use the metaphor from the Greeks, like Sisyphus rolling up the stone, thinking that we can achieve it, and then the stone always runs down. This is the experience that we have to have in the background here. Drewermann illustrates it this way. Someone who occasionally drinks too much may be able to change their behavior based on a good talking to against alcohol. But everything changes from the moment when it becomes inescapably clear this person is an alcoholic. From then on, all admonitions, advice, and reproaches are pointless. Indeed, they're sure to achieve only the opposite. The person will feel even more guilt and wash it away with even more alcohol. They can be helped only if they can be brought first to accept themselves with their problems and conflicts, which incidentally do not actually lie in the alcohol itself. Without whitewashing, but also without renewed accusation and condemnation. The person must gain confidence, have a certain form of trust, that they will be able to live with their tensions and difficulties so that they can develop greater ego strength, which in turn will also render superfluous the escape routes they developed due to their lack of footing. This is a very important point here, to develop greater ego strength. So often Christianity and the message of Jesus, the message of God, has been used to basically liquidate what we call the ego. We often understand the ego through a lens of maybe Buddhism as, oh, it's like the will that believes in the false shapes that are not really any basis of anything, or in Western psychology and philosophy, almost like as us sort of being full of ourselves, having a big ego. That's not what is meant here. What is meant with ego strength, and this term comes out of psychodynamic psychology, is a real solid sense of self that cannot be pushed around, that cannot be used by those who try to ply us into material that can be sent to wars and sacrifice ourselves, that make us sacrifice who we really are to work for the machine, for the capitalist machine, to participate in producing ever more growth, because that's what our GDP depends on. Someone with real ego strength is able to resist a false narrative. Someone with ego strength is somebody who is in touch with their real self, their inalienable real self. So this is the experience that Drewermann says Jesus connected with when he himself had this experience as his baptism. So let's continue here what Drewermann writes about this. We can describe Jesus' attitude along those lines. For him, people do not sin. They are sinners, meaning people in despair. But then the sermon of repentance, the pathos of religious agitation, is pointless, even harmful, because it only promotes the anxiety behind sin. One accuses the symptom, but in doing so, one only strengthens the cause of the disease. People who try to pull out the weeds in the field before the harvest achieve nothing and destroy everything. This is the parable in Matthew 13, chapter 13. Evil cannot be neatly localized to an isolated perimeter. It sits completely matted with its roots between the shoots of the good. And again, if we keep in mind, evil here is not a moral evil, it's our sense of nothingness that creeps in everywhere. So, what is to be done? Does this view not make everything basically even more bleak and desperate? One may wonder what moved Jesus to accept John's baptism, this most fierce document of the ascetic and passionate struggle against evil. How was it possible that he could submit himself to such a superficial practice? For it is true that every exhortation against sin, every indictment of evil, such as John placed at the center of his baptism, does not eliminate guilt, but only makes it more hopeless. But this is perhaps the reason why Jesus allows the ritual of baptism to be performed on him, in order to take it seriously up to the point where its meaning changes. Always and everywhere, people wriggle in the nets of guilt, tearing themselves to death despite all their will to live. I see this in my psychotherapeutic practice, as an aside here, and in stories from people in congregations all the time. There's this attempt to be good, and then something bad happens, and then we ask, why do good things happen to bad? Why do bad things happen to good people? Well, the whole principle is the problem. Let's go back to what Drewermann writes here. What Jesus does through his baptism by John seems to be the fantastical attempt to try things differently for once. And now comes the crucial part here. Not to evade and flee into renewed moral efforts, but to keep still, to wait and to trust that the one who comes towards us in this baptism will do the impossible, that which everyone without exception thinks is impossible, that the one who comes to kill, the one who comes not to kill us, but to save us, In the eyes of Jesus, this one, God, is not the cutthroat and the judge as God seems to us. In order to be able to live at all, one can, one may, yes, one must trust his God, that this God cares about our freedom, about our life. It is as if Jesus, using the symbol of John's baptism, gives himself into death in order to show to himself and to all others, this precisely is the only way to life, meaning to die to all the moralistic efforts in the name of God. All go to John to renounce their sins for fear of God and God's judgment. Only Jesus does not believe in this possibility. He comes to the Baptist to put it to the test and to prove that there is no reason to fear God. I say this again because it's so important. To prove that there is no reason to fear God, that one can openly tell God everything, and that only by entrusting oneself to God, everything becomes good. This is the crucial difference. Now, Drewermann, in the footnotes, this is usually where he has his arguments with the exegetes that shed light on these stories in ways, and this is not all exegetes, I have to say that, but a lot of traditional exegetes, by telling us what these terms mean, what these stories mean in the cultural context, and do this in a way to kind of repeat the phrases and connect it to other instances in which these phrases are used. So here in an important footnote, Drewermann addresses the interpretation that Rudolf Pesch does in the Gospel of Mark. Here's the language, and I'll just read this so that you get a sense of what Drewermann is up against here. Now, you might feel bored, but again, I want you to stay with it. I'm not reading this to bore you, but this is kind of why Drewermann is addressing this. So here's what Rudolf Pesch wrote. And Drewermann argues that this is sort of an external description of what really needs to be understood internally. So Pesch writes that the anabase, which is a technical term, the emergence of after the baptismal process, so after one has been immersed in baptism, one comes out and looks up, that's the anabase, must be regarded as a prerequisite for the reception of the vision that Jesus has there. Heaven really opens only when Jesus has let the Baptist perform the baptism of repentance on him, and the subsequent interpretation vision declares Jesus as the eschatological anointed one, according to the words of Isaiah 42, verse 1, 11, verse 2, and 61, verse 1, as the new Adam. So Drewermann is like, what does this really explain, except to say, okay, we can connect it to the Hebrew Bible, the so-called Old Testament. So here's what Drewermann says to this exegetical interpretation. However, the theological way of speaking of the so-called Christology of the Son of Man, through which one is supposed to understand the vision and the voice from heaven, leaves completely open what is really meant. Which experiences does someone need to make before they can see the heavens open and God as their Father? So much so that from this insight, they receive their whole self-awareness, their calling, and their mission. In a sense, baptism must have meant the same thing to Jesus that the early Christians associated with this symbol, a kind of death and resurrection under the eyes of God. And Drewermann, as I already read further then, talks about how what dies is this idea that we are judged by God and therefore have to, through our moralistic efforts, try to gain the favor of God. This is what actually dies. And the idea that we have to fear God and God's judgment. Instead, we can say everything to God, to the source of life, to the ground under our feet, without fearing that we will be smitten into the abyss, so to speak. In other words, I'll continue here with Drewermann's interpretation, and it's not much more here. In other words, in the experience of baptism, Jesus becomes the one who a little later can call others as well to conversion. Or conversely, only people who in the proximity of Jesus experienced how their lives were transformed could recognize or dream the scene of baptism as the actual reality of the person of Jesus. In order to understand such a text, we must therefore interpret all details as if they had happened to ourselves. So here, Drewermann talks about how to read a story like this and how this story probably was first transmitted, that people had these experiences, and that's how they imagined the scene of the baptism. Because we know that likely there is not actually a lot of historical accuracy in a lot of these descriptions. But what's real is the existential experience people had with Jesus, and that is what fashions this scene. It is probably no coincidence that perhaps the most important theological correction of the entire New Testament is found in this very passage. And I'm going to summarize this here briefly. While Mark still writes in a completely unguarded fashion in his gospel, as the tradition told him, namely that John baptized for the forgiveness of sins, Matthew, who then takes Mark's text, writes very much in the spirit of Jesus that only John baptized, not John baptized for the forgiveness of sins. So what this means is that moral efforts don't lead to the forgiveness of sins. John the Baptist, on some level, believes that moral efforts of giving up one's evil ways, one's proud, willful ways, lead us to convert, to find the meaning. But Jesus, in his experience, realized, no, this is not what leads to the end of despair. It's not the baptism itself. We have to die for this kind of moralistic, to this kind of moralistic effort. Now, Drewermann very nicely connects to an Islamic mystic, a Muslim mystic. It's a beautiful story that actually illustrates everything here. So he writes, an Islamic mystic once asked his students what the correct way was to fear God. The students answered, that one loves God. But the master shook his head and replied, not in you thinking we love God. One who thinks I love God is still under coercion. This is how you shall speak. I firmly believe that God loves me. That is the correct way to fear God. And Drewermann elaborates a little bit in a footnote and quotes a little more, which I want to share with you as well because it's significant. This is portrayed in Tor Andre, a book that you can also find, Andrae, in a book in the Garden of Myrtles, Studies in Early Islamic Mysticism, which was published in the Sunni series in Muslim Spirituality in South Asia. And so on page 109 here is the quote. At the beginning, Abu Yazid says, I imagined that it was I who thought of God, knew him and loved him. When I reached the end, I realized that he had thought of me before I thought of him, that he had known me before I knew him, that his love for me preceded my love for him, and that he sought me first so that I could then seek him. This attitude changes truly everything, Drewermann continues. At the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist, we see all at once the heavens open and the barriers disappear. And we see God committing God's self and declaring, this is my beloved Son. God uses such words to address a person who beyond all anxiety turns to God with trust, or despite all anxiety. These words are from God, my beloved Son. In Christianity, as I said, we have reserved this as a title, and this is my interpretation now. We have reserved as a title for Jesus, this beloved Son. But in doing so, we have done the same thing that the Egyptians did with the Pharaoh, as I already explained. So Drewermann cites here a very influential study in exegesis by Ferdinand Hahn called The Titles of Jesus in Christology. And he specifically references page 294 here in the English version, where Hahn talks about this title and so on. And let me just quote this briefly here. Hahn writes, first of all, the early conception of Jesus' work as that of a charismatic person laid hold upon by God, so that there are different lines of interpretation in this term Son of God. So first of all, the early conception of Jesus' work as that of a charismatic person laid hold upon by God. Further, the Hellenistic Jewish interpretation of the man of God mighty in the spirit. Finally, the conception of the Messiah as Son of God, as shown by reminiscence of Psalm 2:7. There remains preserved only the adoption of God as Son of God, understood in the sense of an appointment to office and the bestowal of the Spirit, meaning in this particular passage here in Mark 1:9. Now, here's what Drewermann comments to this quote by Hahn. In such, yes, historically correct phrases, we always learn only what certain groups 2,000 years ago wanted to say about Jesus with certain images. However, the task is to participate in what happens when someone experiences in themselves what is being portrayed, meaning in these stories, in this title. This is not a matter of psychologizing the Christ event, as a reproach against or accusation against Drewermann has been made by no less than Pope Benedict XVI, but of letting this event take place in the listener themselves. But then we may no longer simply continue to speak in the given formulas, but must rather try to understand the formulas themselves as an expression of condensed experiences in closeness to God. Now, just think about how radical this is. Next time you go to church and there is this reference to Jesus as Lord and as Savior and as Son of God and all of that, and you realize that saying these terms in themselves doesn't really do anything. Yes, we can whip ourselves into a frenzy by repeating these terms and sort of affectatiously make something out of it, but that is not what these terms are meant to do. What these terms are meant to do is not to distance Jesus from it as, oh, the big honcho over there, but rather what do these terms actually mean about who we are also in reference to God? This is a very, very dangerous thing. This is a very empowering thing, because then Jesus cannot be used and whipped around like a whip over us. Instead, Jesus becomes someone who is in solidarity with us. Similar to, as I've said in a previous lecture, to Jesus in liberation theology movements, as the one who empowers us and is connected with our experience. God is not visible in fear, in so-called penitential rigor, and in terror. These are all experiences people have when God is hidden. God becomes visible, audible, only through trust, or better yet, in the vicinity of God's love, which is worthy of our trust. So this is a very important point here, is when the language of God becomes traumatic itself, it's important that what it is meant to really talk about is not the term God, but the experience of trust. Wherever this healing, liberating experience of trust is present, that is where God is present, even if there is no reference to God. And wherever there is reference to God, but this experience of trust is not present, there the God of Jesus is actually not present. This is the revolutionary new way of reading the Bible, because it goes against the conceptual fetishism. This is a term Drewermann has used, that has ravaged Christianity, that has turned Christianity in a moralistic yardstick, that has mutilated the souls of people and has been used to justify the killing of people outside. Drewermann continues, this is probably why at the baptism of Jesus in the Jordan, the image of the dove appears once more, descending from heaven as the embodiment of God's Spirit, as the epitome of the way God really thinks of the world and is disposed towards humans. A dove of peace, a relative of the third dove which Noah sent out at the end of the great flood, to test when the earth would again become the ground under his feet. This is a wonderful image of grace and a wonderful image for the way in which God makes God's self known to humans in the figure of Christ. Namely, no punitive action, no extermination, No more opposition between God and humans, but only what is the most improbable: reconciliation between humans and their Creator. This ends our lecture for today on the difference between John the Baptist and Jesus' view of what heaven is, view of what God is, view of how life can turn around, how we can experience our true self in relation to a God who lets us live. We will continue next week with our fourth lecture. I thank you for listening. I invite you to check out Drewermann's books in English, which will be listed in the description of this video and also in a comment. Also, if you're interested in a more comprehensive picture of Drewermann's whole work, at least up to 2004, you can check out my book, A Violent God Image, an introduction to the work of Eugen Drewermann. And just to be clear, this is not that Drewermann is preaching or arguing for a violent God image. He is analyzing a violent God image. He is deconstructing a violent God image that is structurally so present in so much of Christianity and has shaped Western culture thoroughly. It has to be worked through in all parts of our world, because Christianity, by colonizing Western civilization, by colonizing in this violent Christian spirit, the entire world has had a tremendous harmful impact. And Drewermann's revolutionary way of interpreting is an attempt to undo this, to recover the non-violent view of God as an absolute anchor of love and trust that is no longer experienced in traumatic ways that would be against us as humans, or be against nature, or be used to harm nature or animals. So long until next week. Bye-bye.